Okay. Now, if you were the governors of a brutal, Neanderthal, shambling, hairy, vicious creature, which of these characters would be most likely for you to follow? Plato is saying, let's take life and remodel it. Aristotle says, let's know more of life, but meanwhile serve the king. Absolute monarchies. So, this is where Aristotle was picked and chosen to act as kind of a template for some of the guides that became later Rome. Incidentally, just for the heck of it, trivia game. Socrates and Plato, of course, were troublemakers and did get into trouble. I can't remember how Plato died, but I know that Socrates was killed by people forced him to drink poison. And that's how Socrates died. Dumb question number one. Which of these characters would be chosen by a vicious, aggressive plutocracy? Aristotle, yeah. By the time that we got around to 50 BC, and incidentally, it's very common, I mean it happens, it's got to happen, that anybody that is aggressive, warlike, or peaceful, I suppose, develops their own philosophies and perspectives to support why they do the way they do. By this time, there was quite a bit less emphasis on great histories than on new forces that were steadily gaining power. Now, another weird thing was happening here, which was... I always feel silly about saying this. You know this old saying that money is the root of all evil? Well, this is funny. I don't know, maybe it's sick. Starting to happen around there. I'd like to read you a quote. Now, before you collapse into giggles, when I start talking about this money is the root of all evil thing, I don't know, is this where it came from? I mean, who knows? I'd like to consider you to consider this quote. I made note of this. That the first actual coins that were minted, if you're a coin collector, you'd know this, came from Lydia. Not John Prine's Lydia, a location. And for all of this time, the world largely existed on trade and barter. Trade and barter so that if you're going to want some building materials for your house, you would trade pigs, chickens. I don't know if they had pigs. You would trade livestock, or you would trade that you needed to do something for your son's education, and what you would do is that you would go out and you would work for this fellow for a week, a month. It was a trade and barter system. There wasn't very much around for coinage, and trade and barter systems were used throughout this whole time. It wasn't a very effective system. It worked all right as long as you never really went very far from home. Not being, facetious. Until 100 years ago, most people didn't go far from home. So it was all right. They used measures, cubits, for instance, like somebody's hand is going to be the measurement. And of course, my hand is going to be different than your hand, so there was always variation, there's problems like that. Trade and barter, all through this. Now, what Rome started to do is that they said, since Rome was getting into bigger and bigger and bigger areas, bigger than what I've got written there, I mean, Rome had made explorations all over the place by that time. They weren't actually there to occupy, but they were all over the place. As they ran into increasingly farther from home and different peoples with different things going on, it became a good idea to standardize money. Standardizing money. And this is the first time that the concept of standardizing cash ever came about. If you think about it, it was never possible before. Nobody had ever been that big. Nobody had ever been that big to standardize and enforce a system of coinage. Now, with that in mind, give a listen to this quote. H.G. Wells wrote a book called The Outline of History in 1920, and he's some of these fun Victorian guys that are kind of neat to read. Quote, "Another respect in which the Roman system was an anticipation of our own was that it was a cash and credit system. Money had been in the world only for a few centuries, but the use of it had been growing. Money was a good medium for trade, and in Republic Rome, the financier and the money began to play a part that's recognizably similar to the parts played today." Now, the first effect of money is a symbolic thing. It's not like you're going to trade your burro, for something else. You can trade something that's this big for work, for property, for anything. It's a symbolic wealth, but really different than what had been happening before. Now, the first thing that money can do is it gives a lot of freedom of movement. It gives a lot of freedom of movement to things that hadn't happened before. And that's the peculiar value of money. The peculiar value of money. Instead of a worker being paid in such a way that he's tied to his work, money leaves him free to do what he wants. He can eat his money, right? He can drink it. He can give it to a temple. He can spend it in learning. He can save it. Now, that was the freedom of money. But the freedom that money gave to the poor man, because in Rome by this time we were having huge differences of wealth and poverty. The money that was given to poor men was nothing compared to the freedom that it gave to the wealthy people. With money, rich men didn't have to be tied to the land. With money, rich men didn't have to be tied to houses. Rich men didn't have to be tied to flocks. Rich men didn't have to be tied to herds. Rich people could change their location. And they could move around with a freedom that was unheard of until now. Now, people began to buy land, which was a bizarre concept at that time. Brand new. They wouldn't buy a land to use it anymore, like people had always picked up, maybe they inherit their father's farm. I mean, this is nothing new. But people would buy land not to use it, but they would buy it so that they could sell it later for a profit. This had never happened before. This had never happened before. Now,